And as we noted, the first test of that legislative and executive branch dominance will be confirming the president-elect's top officials, which now includes multiple picks that are prompting some backlash. Just moments ago, Mr. Trump posted on his social media that Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz will be his pick for Attorney General. And the transition team announced former Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard as the president-elect's pick for Director of National Intelligence. Plus, late yesterday, they announced Fox News host and military veteran Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. That announcement surprising some Senate Republicans and even some of Mr. Trump's allies.
He's a Fox News host.
I don't know Pete, so I just don't know anything about him. Okay.
I think first of all, it surprised me. I didn't see it coming.
I will say I was surprised because I didn't hear his name mentioned, but there's been several people's names that's come out of left field too, and this is where President Trump was really good about putting people in place.
I'm just surprised. I'm not going to comment whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. I'm just surprised because the names that I've heard for Secretary of Defense have not included him.
Joining me now, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Tsirkin, Ken Dilanian, and Courtney Kube at the Pentagon. Thank you all for joining me. Julie, let's start with you and the news that Republicans now have control of the House. It is by a narrow margin, but break down what this means.
Yeah, they have narrow control of the House. All of the news has really been sucked up by this Gaetz pick, though. And speaking of control of the House, Steve Scalise, who's in Republican leadership in the House, actually reacting to the Gaetz pick, said, stop taking our guys. And it's because they have such a tight, narrow margin. There are still several races uncalled, but you see on your screen they're at that 218 number. Look, they've been operating with a 4 or 5 seat majority when Democrats were in the White House. Now that Trump is there, they need every vote they can get to get his sweeping agenda across the finish line. Of course, Trump has not operated with control of the House and Senate on his side in his first term, so this is already going to be a step up for him. They're talking about things like, of course, getting rid of the debt limit or lowering that debt limit, changing the way our tax policy works, extending those tax cuts from 2017, overhauling the southern border, immigration, and of course, all of these cabinet picks and people that Trump is floating. That Senate majority is going to be crucial to confirm all of those appointments. But certainly House leaders thrilled. Speaker Mike Johnson going to continue to hold the gavel after that endorsement behind closed doors by President-elect Trump this morning. Kristen.
Well, Julie, let's talk about some of the picks that you just ran through. Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth. Do you think that they are confirmable at this point? What's the buzz on the Hill right now?
Well, I mean, I hope you don't forgive me for saying this, Kristen, but the general vibe on the Hill right now is WTF. People are shocked at the news of Gaetz, especially. I feel like I couldn't even get around to getting reaction on Tulsi Gabbard when this pick of Gaetz came down the pike. Senators, Republican lawmakers even, one of them in a closed-door meeting said, oh, my God, when they saw the post from Donald Trump. Several senators, I just ran into Lindsey Graham, for example, who kind of brushed me off and said he didn't speak to Trump yet. We'll see, he said, if Gaetz is confirmable, if he's a good pick. Chuck Grassley, who's going to be the top Republican on the Judiciary Committee, working very closely with the next Attorney General. He really didn't have anything to say. He stood there for 30 seconds just completely baffled when reporters told him about this. Others like Collins, Murkowski, those who are seen to deflect from whatever Trump tries to do, they're press handlers basically pushing us aside. And it is because look at who Gaetz is. He's currently under investigation by the House Ethics Committee for some of these personal misgivings that he's been a part of, some of the things that the federal government has investigated him on and later dropped charges on. He is still very much being investigated by that House committee. Bipartisan sentiment across the aisle is they really can't believe that Gaetz is the one who ended up with this top job. And the question of if he's confirmable, well, you talk about all these picks. This really is the biggest test between Senate Republicans and Trump, and a test of their allyship to him, too.
It sure is, Julie. It's well put. Ken, let me go to you now at DOJ. What has the reaction been from inside the Justice Department for the reasons that Julie just laid out so well? The fact that he's currently being investigated by the Ethics Committee of the House. And of course, he is someone who has been a loyal Trump ally. He's also someone for who, example, clashed with Kevin McCarthy, really responsible, taking the charge and ousting him. How are folks within DOJ reacting to this?
With shock and horror, Kristen. I had two different people texting me just the one word, insane. in reaction to this. And let's just be very clear about this. He's under investigation by the Ethics Committee now. He had been under criminal investigation by the Justice Department. They announced earlier this year that they opted not to charge him in that case. But there are prosecutors working right now in the Justice Department who know a lot of facts about that investigation that the public does not know. It was a sex trafficking investigation. And the second thing to point out is that members of the Trump administration testified to the January 6th committee that Matt Gaetz went to the White House and asked for a blanket pardon, presumably covering the allegations in that criminal investigation and other matters for some period of time. He didn't get that pardon. But the other thing to say is that there are a few members of Congress who have attacked the Justice Department and the FBI in more aggressive and extreme language than Matt Gaetz. Every single time FBI Director Chris Wray or Attorney General Merrick Garland came up to the Hill and appeared before the Judiciary Committee on which Mr. Gaetz sits, he would make a point of going after them and accusing them of unethical behavior and of saying that the Justice Department had been weaponized. And the idea that he would be going over there now to run it, just strikes fear in the hearts of the civil servants who work over there. I've been doing a lot of reporting on this, and there is no plan for a mass exodus. People have their heads down. They are ready to fulfill the policies of a new Trump administration. But this is a different matter. They revere the rule of law. They revere norms. And they are very nervous about a figure like this who is, as the New Yorker magazine put it in a profile a few months ago, an agent of chaos, Kristen.
Well, and speaking of which, obviously, President-elect Trump campaigned on a promise to enact what he called retribution. He said, "I will be your retribution." He's talked about the quote-unquote enemy from within in recent weeks. This is from Trump ally Steve Bannon, who just said to me in a brief phone interview, President Trump is going to hit the Justice Department with a blowtorch, and Matt Gaetz is that torch. What do you make of that in the context of the conversations that you're having inside DOJ?
Well, look, obviously, even before this appointment, Kristen, we were doing a lot of reporting about this question of Donald Trump's vow to use the Justice Department to go after his enemies. How would that work? How would the career civil servants inside the Justice Department react? And here's the thing. It's going to be a lot harder than people think it is, even if Matt Gaetz eventually becomes the Attorney General, because there's a thin layer of political appointees over the Justice Department, and then there are a lot of career civil servants who actually make things work. And you can order them to open an investigation, but they have to have predication in order to get a search warrant from a judge, for example, or a subpoena. They can't just do that out of thin air. And even if they did, there's a court system in place. There are checks and balances. There's a jury system. But one dark possibility that people have discussed is it wouldn't be terribly difficult for an attorney general to name a special counsel, which would then handpick their own FBI agents of a like-minded ilk and start investigating people. And even if, it didn't go very far, you'd have to have people spending a lot of money on legal fees. We saw this to a much lesser degree with the John Durham investigation, John Durham, special counsel, spent years investigating the Mueller investigation and the Russia investigation and brought a couple of cases that ended in acquittal and did a lot of investigating that never saw the light of day. But a lot of people, including CIA officers that I know personally, had to spend a lot of money on legal fees and had to sit for long interviews. And it's a very unpleasant thing to be under investigation by the federal government. So there can be some impact here. But again, it's harder than people think to just simply use the Justice Department to prosecute your enemies. Kristen.
Well, fascinating reporting and reaction, Ken, that you're getting. Let's head over to Courtney Kube, Pentagon correspondent. Court, thanks so much for joining us on this incredibly busy day. So obviously another Trump pick that's raising eyebrows, Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary. He is a Fox News host. He has served. Talk to me about the reaction that you're hearing inside the Defense Department.
Surprise. It seems to be that's the word of the day here, surprise, with the Tulsi Gabbard nomination or a recommendation for DNI, and then now with Matt Gaetz. But Pentagon officials, when this came out pretty late last night, were surprised. Pete Hegseth was not one of the people whose name had been commonly spoken about as a possibility to come here and run the Pentagon. And the reality is, Kristen, he's not a classic candidate. So in recent years, we have seen several retired four-star generals, including the current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who've been nominated to the post. But this is the first time that we have had someone in recent memory who really doesn't have any experience running a large bureaucracy or really leading anything of this magnitude. This building, this Pentagon, the Department of Defense, has 1.3 million active duty service members. There's another 1.5 million Guard, Reserve, and DoD civilians, and it's an $800+ billion budget. This is an enormous bureaucracy, and it would come, if in fact he is confirmed, his time as Secretary of Defense would come at an extremely fraught time in this world. He'd have to deal with the situation, the war in Ukraine, and with Russia's continuing fighting there. There's now North Korean troops that are assisting Russia in some way to fight against Ukraine. There's the ongoing conflicts with Israel and Lebanon, Lebanese Hezbollah, and in Gaza. Just today, we've gotten some information from U.S. Central Command about a large mission, 3-day-long mission of U.S. strikes against Houthis in Yemen. The U.S. has continued to come under attack by militia groups and Iranian-backed Shia militia groups in Iran and in Syria. There are a tremendous number of difficult issues, and I haven't even yet mentioned what will come up during President Donald Trump's term, and that is the year 2027, when the expectation is the Chinese military will be prepared to invade Taiwan should they decide to do so. This is an incredibly dangerous time for someone as Secretary of Defense, and the reality is he's simply not the classic nominee. He is a Fox News media personality. He does have military experience, but Kristen, he served at a relatively junior role in the National Guard. He did several deployments, Iraq, Afghanistan, and down to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. But even those were in pretty junior roles, as the most senior one being a captain. He got out several years ago as a major. Again, we don't have any indication of problems in his record. He has a number of awards, but he didn't really serve in a leadership role. And that's why people here are so surprised by this pick, Kristen.
You know, he's been critical of some of the Pentagon's diversity initiative, which comports with some of your reporting that you anticipate there will be a turnover to some extent of the personnel at the Pentagon.
Yeah, there are two big issues that people really have top of mind here today with a Pete Hegseth running the Pentagon. Number one is the diversity issues. He has been very outspoken about the fact that any leadership here, generals or admirals, who have amplified or really supported diversity issues in the military need to be fired. He had openly spoken about C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as one of those. There's a pretty widespread belief here that if in fact he comes in, and frankly, that Donald Trump would support the idea of firing a number of the senior military leaders here in the building and potentially around the world. That's not the only one, though, Kristen. Women in combat. There are a lot of people who are talking about that. He has spoken very openly about how he believes that women should not serve in combat roles. He's called it a potential readiness issue. He says women simply cannot serve in these difficult roles. The reality is combat roles have been open to women since 2016, and the basic facts here are women have not only been able to meet the standards for serving in those roles, but women have repeatedly exceeded over that time, meeting some of the most stringent and difficult physical standards and mental and emotional standards for those roles. Women have continued to do so, Kristen. So the question is, what could he do? Could he change the policy? But even if he doesn't, there's a concern here that among a number of officials who I've spoken with, this could have a chilling effect on women who serve in uniform, that they may simply see themselves as devalued if that's what their Secretary of Defense is saying about them.
Well, as always, Courtney, your reporting is just incredible. Thank you so much for bringing so much of it to us on such a big news day. Really appreciate it. President-elect Trump made his first trip to the White House since his election night victory at the current president's invitation. Seated together, President Biden again today pledged a smooth transition of power.
Looking forward to having like we said, a smooth transition. Do everything we can to make sure you're accommodated, what you need. And we're going to get a chance to talk about some of that today. So
good.
Welcome
Thank you
back.
very much. And thank you very much. And politics is tough. And it's, in many cases, not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today, and I appreciate it very much. A transition that's so smooth, it'll be as smooth as it can get, and I very much appreciate that, Jim.
You're welcome.
Just a remarkable sight there. Today's visit was in stark contrast to this time 4 years ago, when then President Trump refused to abide by the tradition of hosting the president-elect and tried to overturn the election. Now, as we've said, Mr. Trump will return to Washington fully backed by a Republican-controlled Senate and a Republican-controlled House. And on that breaking news that we've been reporting that President-elect Trump has chosen Congressman Matt Gaetz to be his Attorney General, we are getting some of our first reaction to the news. Here's Senator Marco Rubio, Trump's pick for Secretary of State, talking to reporters just moments ago. Listen.
Senator Matt Gaetz was also nominated to be the Attorney General of the United States. Would you support that nomination?
Well, I'll be involved in my own. I know Matt for a long time. At one point, years ago, when I was in the state legislature, he actually worked for me when I was aspiring to be Speaker of the House. So I've known him for a long time. And again, I think the president is entitled to his team, and he's made his appointments. And I like Matt a lot. I know him very well, and I'm confident that if the Senate confirms him, he would do a good job. And again, presidents are entitled to have the people that they want in these key positions.
All right, joining me now is NBC's Garrett Haake. He's covering the Trump transition, and New York Times Chief White House Correspondent Peter Baker. He's also an NBC News political analyst. Thanks so much to both of you for joining me. Garrett, just remarkable to hear Senator Marco Rubio, who has, of course, been nominated for another major cabinet position, to be weighing in on Matt Gaetz to be nominated for Attorney General, Secretary of State. That position, of course, he talked about how honored he was to be nominated for that role. Garrett, take us inside where we all are and the reaction that you're hearing on the Hill.
Kristen, the reaction here was varying degrees of shock and stunned silence, eye rolls, asking questions of if we were serious. That's from Republicans and Democrats when the news about Matt Gaetz was started to be made public up here. But I have to tell you, you're also starting to hear versions of what you heard from Marco Rubio there, the idea that the president is entitled to his team. That's coming from Senate Republicans who have, to such a large degree, rolled over for what Donald Trump has had to say about the Department of Justice, about the FBI, about the criminal prosecutions against him, that now opposing a Matt Gaetz nomination for the things that Gaetz has said about those same issues would put them in a very difficult territory with a president that they have chosen to support to the hilt, and with his base, whom they've now sort of agreed with on this basic premise. Now, Gaetz also has a personal history that might trip him up with lawmakers, as feud with Kevin McCarthy that ultimately led to McCarthy getting tossed as Speaker, and the investigation into him that ended without charges filed that he might somehow be involved in sex trafficking. Again, that was an investigation by the Justice Department that ended without charges filed, but the questions will certainly come up in the confirmation process. We are very early in this story, but I think it's pretty clear that at least where we stand right now, what will be the most contentious confirmation of the Donald Trump cabinet nominees that we know so far.
Well, let me follow up with you on, excuse me, Garrett, that point. Because the question is, can these picks get confirmed? And give us your sense, because when this day started, based on our conversations, the reporting I've watched that you've been delivering, the sense is, look, Republicans want to confirm Trump's picks. They want to do it before the inauguration. That's what Senator Barrasso told me this weekend. But again, this raises a whole new question about whether that's possible and whether Matt Gaetz is confirmable.
Candidly, Kristen, I don't think it really changes that basic question. Donald Trump is daring the Republican Senate, the Republican-controlled Senate, to stand up to him when they have given almost no reason to think that they will. I mean, this is a Republican Senate that has catered to Donald Trump's whim on basically every issue, and the idea that they're going to stand up to him now after he just won what he and what they, for the last several days, have been describing as an overwhelming mandate, now they're going to say that he's not entitled to the picks that he has chosen to make to fill out his cabinet. I would be very surprised, but they're going to be put in a very difficult position of defending those choices and defending the conduct of some of these people who Donald Trump has picked. But again, he can afford to lose a couple of votes. There's some people who can walk on this and get somebody like Matt Gaetz still confirmed. He only has to get to 50. He's going to have 52, 53 votes to play with. And I think you're going to see messy confirmation hearings, and a lot of Republicans put in very difficult places if they want to stand up to this president or if they're going to continue on the road of enabling him on all of these issues, including and especially on his handling and how he talks about the justice system.
Well, Peter Baker, pick up on that point, because you have covered your fair share of transitions. We are certainly witnessing an extraordinary one. What do you make of the developments of the day, including the fact that Republicans now have control of the House of Representatives and therefore all three branches of government in Washington.
Yeah, they have control of the House of Representatives at least until Trump keeps taking away their members, right? I mean, this is the third House member he's just plucked away for his administration, meaning that it's very conceivable that the Republicans won't be able to muster a manageable majority, at least at first, until special elections replace some of these people. It's a very tenuous situation for them. Will certainly delay any major legislation that has to get through in the early days because they won't have, the authority to operate in the same way if they had even the marginal majority they seem to have won the election. But in any case, I think broadly speaking, all these Garrett says are correct about Matt Gaetz. I mean, look, if you took a secret ballot the way they did today on the leadership in the Senate Republican conference, there's no way on earth Matt Gaetz would be confirmed. He is not their cup of tea. It's hard to exaggerate just how out of the mainstream, even for the Republican Party today, Matt Gaetz really is. He would never have passed the vet for Attorney General in any administration we've seen in our lifetime. I'm not sure he would pass the vet to get an assistant U.S. attorney prosecutor job in any Justice Department we've seen in our lifetime. But he is the president's choice. He is daring, as Garrett said, he is daring the Senate Republicans to prove their loyalty to him. And he's sending a signal, I think, to the extent that people were asking how far would Trump go in this idea of retribution in this second term, or will he back off and try to focus on his policy priorities? I think he just told us. He picked somebody who is an avowed critic of Justice Department system as it has worked, who has been a target of it, who has his own, therefore, strong feelings about how it's worked and how it ought to be used against the president's enemies. So I think that anybody who thought that maybe the president-elect wasn't going to follow through on some of his threats to go after his adversaries, I think he's given them a response today.
It's such an important point, Peter. Talk about this moment, the significance of President-elect Trump going to the White House, the optics of that, the fact that you have both leaders sitting there saying, yes, this will be a smooth transition, despite the fact that, of course, 4 years ago, it was not a smooth, it was not a peaceful transition. And yet here we are.
Yeah, here we are. Wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall?
Yes.
And that means the camera's out, right? My guess is it wasn't a super candid conversation. These are two men who don't like each other. But, it goes beyond that. I mean, most incoming and outgoing presidents of different parties don't particularly like each other. Either they just campaigned against each other or, campaigned for their fellow members of a party. But this isn't Obama, Romney. This isn't like even Bush, Gore. I mean, President Biden has said that former President Trump, President-elect Trump, is a threat to American democracy as we see it. He has said all kinds of things about him, just as President-elect Trump has said about President Biden. He's, in fact, promised to appoint a special counsel to investigate President Biden once he takes office. So obviously no love lost in this meeting, a very kind of awkward civility, but President Biden was determined to demonstrate that whatever Trump does in terms of standards and norms, President Biden, on his way out, is going to uphold the traditions and the protocols and the civility and niceties of the American system. He's going to demonstrate a model, even if that model is about to be rewritten by his successor.
Garrett, let me just final point to you. Take us inside the Trump transition team right now. What are folks saying to you? Here they are rolling out these picks by the president-elect, wasting no time really filling in the blanks of who he wants to serve in his cabinet.
Yeah, look, Kristen, I think this is a team with a chip on their shoulders. They were during the campaign. They're so now during the transition. They are trying to move at a very rapid pace. They're trying to show that they can be organized, that they can be on message, whatever else you might think of that message. And they want to show that they are going to act on the mandate that they believe that Donald Trump has. If personnel is policy, I think we're getting a very clear look at what's important to Donald Trump through some of these early picks that he's making, not just Gaetz, but the immigration-related picks, Tulsi Gabbard at DNI. This is somebody who ran on, burning down the system, and he's proving that he's putting the team around him to do it when he gets back to Washington.
All right. Well, great conversation. Thank you both so much, Garrett and Peter Baker.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.